There may have been moments when you quietly asked yourself, am I really in the right place? Not in terms of location, but in terms of how it feels. Libra is often very good at creating harmony for others, at smoothing the edges, at making things feel balanced. But sometimes that very ability can cause you to forget your own sense of belonging. Not because love was missing, but because you became used to adjusting yourself so everything could stay peaceful. Lately, a different kind of feeling may have begun to surface. It's subtle, not loud, not dramatic. Like walking into a room and suddenly realizing you don't need to change anything in order to stay. Clarity doesn't always arrive through big conversations. It doesn't need raised voices or perfectly chosen words. It shows up through small actions, through how someone shows up, all through consistency, through a sense of safety you don't have to talk yourself into. If you're a Libra and you've been noticing these quiet shifts in how love feels, in how respect shows itself, in the way you're being treated, this may be a moment to slow down and listen a little more closely. To begin with that moment when belonging is no longer something you have to work for. At a certain point in life, Libra no longer seeks validation in the old ways. It's no longer about big questions spoken out loud. It becomes something quieter, smaller moments, still moments. Moments when you gently ask yourself something simpler. Am I allowed to be myself here? Belonging, in the end, isn't about how many people are around you. It's the feeling of your body finally softening, of your breath no longer tightening when you speak your truth. It's that subtle sense of ease when you don't have to wonder whether you've done something not enough. Libra often grows up with a deep sensitivity. You read the room. You hear what isn't being said. You know when to step back to keep things balanced. And sometimes you become so used to standing in the middle, being the bridge, that you forget you also need a place to lean. Lately, you may have noticed a change that's hard to name. Not a crisis, not a big decision, just a quiet exhaustion from having to explain too much. From holding yourself together so everything stays fine. And instead of pushing through, you choose silence, not to endure, but to listen to yourself. Clarity during this phase doesn't arrive as a complete answer. It comes little by little, through how others behave when you stop trying to please, through how you respond when a boundary is honored or ignored, and most importantly, through how it feels inside you afterward, lighter or heavier after each interaction. Mature connection isn't always dramatic. Most of the time, it's quiet, steady. And sometimes, it's that very calm that helps you realize how long you were living in tension before. Libra begins to understand that respect isn't an abstract idea. It lives in ordinary moments, in words that match actions, in silence that isn't used as punishment, in not having to shrink yourself so others can stay comfortable. There are moments when you notice you're no longer on guard, no longer preparing explanations in advance, no longer bracing yourself to be misunderstood from the start. Your heart opens slowly, not because of promises, but because you feel safe in your own energy. And maybe, for the first time in a long while, you allow yourself to walk away from places that require you to tense up just to exist. No noise, no blame, just the clarity to see that some connections aren't wrong. They're simply no longer aligned. What's precious is this. When you stop searching for belonging outside of yourself, it begins to appear within. When you stop negotiating your worth, when you stop trading peace for the image of harmony, when you allow yourself to be whole, with real needs, clear boundaries, and honest emotions. Libra wasn't born to live in conflict, but you also weren't born to sacrifice yourself for surface-level peace. True balance arrives when you're respected without having to ask, when you're loved without losing yourself. If this season brings more quiet into your life, trust that it isn't empty. It's helping you see what deserves to stay and what is ready to be released, not to close your heart, but to open it in the right places. And perhaps the sense of belonging you've been searching for all along never truly left. It's been waiting for you to come back to the truth of who you are. After clarity begins to be felt in a quiet, natural way, Libra reaches a deeper layer of emotional experience. It's no longer about who's right and who's wrong. It becomes a more honest question. Am I being respected here? There's something Libra is relearning slowly, in a very grown, very human way. Love is not about dissolving yourself just to keep everything smooth. It's not about always standing in the middle, always calming things down, always giving in to avoid conflict. And it's not about convincing yourself that you're fine, when inside, you're already tired. True respect doesn't make you smaller. It doesn't ask you to shrink your needs to fit someone else's comfort. It doesn't require you to hide your boundaries just to keep the mood pleasant. And it certainly doesn't ask you to stay quiet for the sake of peace and carry the weight alone afterward. In more mature connections, you begin to notice something subtle. When you speak up, the atmosphere doesn't collapse. When you say no, tension doesn't automatically follow. And when you need time for yourself, it isn't treated as distance. Libra slowly realizes that being heard isn't just about someone listening to your words. It's about those words being given weight. Your opinions aren't gently brushed aside. Your feelings aren't dismissed with reasonable explanations. And difference isn't treated as a threat to harmony. There are very small moments, but they're enough to let you know something is changing. A conversation that isn't interrupted. A decision made together, not from just one side. A moment when you hold a boundary, and it's respected without debate. These moments don't create drama, but they create a foundation. And from that foundation, Libra begins to set down an old burden, the burden of always being the one who keeps the balance, the burden of understanding first, giving in first, adjusting first. You start to see that real balance can't come from one side alone, and it can't last if you're the only one trying. This isn't a miracle. Nothing suddenly changes on the outside. You simply changed your inner standard, quietly, all but decisively. You no longer accept connections that make you question your own worth. You stop negotiating boundaries that should never have been up for debate, and you stop calling endurance understanding. For Libra now, mature love is no longer measured by intensity. It's measured by peace when you're together, by not having to explain yourself over and over again, and by the feeling that you get to be yourself, not the most agreeable version, but the most honest one. You may still be learning how to stand firmly in this. There may still be moments of hesitation, old habits that want to soften things just to keep the peace. But every time you choose to respect yourself, you're teaching others how to treat you. And the most important thing Libra begins to understand is this: love doesn't disappear when boundaries exist. It only disappears when respect is gone. When respect is present, balance is no longer a weight you carry alone. It becomes a shared rhythm, slow, steady, and strong enough that you don't lose yourself along the way. There is a very specific kind of relief when you no longer feel the need to stay on guard, not the loud kind of relief, not celebratory, but the quiet feeling of your body no longer tightening before every conversation. You stop preparing explanations for every possible misunderstanding. You stop scanning every small reaction, asking yourself what you might have done that was not enough today. This change arrives quietly. There is no marked moment, no clear milestone. Just one day, you notice you spoke your truth without editing your words. One evening, you sit in silence without feeling anxious. Another time, that you set a boundary and feel no guilt. Libra begins to sense this from within. Your heart opens, and it doesn't feel dangerous. Not because the world suddenly became perfect, but because something inside you has changed the way it responds. You are no longer standing in a defensive posture, no longer ready to retreat before anyone has even reached you. That alone says a great deal. Either the environment around you has become safer, or you have grown strong enough to open your heart without losing yourself. And maybe it's a combination of both. Libra once learned to protect themselves through politeness, by softening the atmosphere, by placing other people's needs first to avoid conflict. That approach carried you through many difficult seasons, but it also required you to wear a very thin layer of armor, subtle enough that no one noticed it, yet heavy enough to leave you exhausted. Now, as that armor begins to come off, you realize you are not becoming weaker. On the contrary, you are becoming more fully present. You listen without disappearing in the process. You share without fearing that your needs will be labeled as too much. There are connections where you no longer have to prove yourself. No need to control the direction of the story. No need to keep everything okay at any cost. In those connections, safety is not spoken aloud. It's felt through the smallest details. You begin to trust your own sense more, not to draw conclusions, but to notice when your body is finally resting, when your heart no longer has to tense up just to survive. And you may come to understand something deeply important. Not every door needs to be opened. Opening your heart does not mean handing over control. It simply means you are no longer closing yourself off out of fear. Libra learns that safety does not come from predicting every possible wound. It comes from knowing that if something is not right, you are clear enough to recognize it and brave enough to walk away without losing your self-respect. When the heart is no longer armored, you do not become fragile. You become clearer with yourself about what makes you shrink and what allows you to open naturally. There may still be moments when you hesitate. Old reflexes can return very quickly. But each time you choose to return to that inner sense of safety, you are teaching yourself something new. Opening your heart does not have to cost you your sense of self. And that is when Libra begins to feel a very quiet kind of freedom. Not freedom from others, but freedom from the fear of always being on guard. Freedom to be yourself, without armor, without bracing, without planning an exit in advance. You may not have a name for this feeling yet, but you recognize it when it appears, a deeper breath, a silence that no longer feels threatening, and a heart that opens, not out of recklessness, but because it finally feels safe enough to stay. The most interesting shift happens when Libra stops asking what's missing. You no longer search for a sense of belonging in other people's eyes. You stop trying to read a room just to figure out where you're supposed to stand. There's simply a very quiet moment when you realize you're staying with yourself, and belonging begins to appear from there. Not because someone comes to save you, not because a new relationship suddenly provides all the answers, but because you stop abandoning yourself in the moments when you most need to be heard. Before, belonging often felt like a goal, a place you had to be chosen for, a space you needed permission to enter. And sometimes, to feel that sense of belonging, you adjusted yourself more than was necessary. Now, when you stop chasing that question, everything moves differently. You no longer maintain connections just to keep the peace. You stop staying in conversations that require you to tense up just to be understood. And you no longer trade your peace for the feeling of not being left behind. That Libra begins to choose in a very natural way, not through sharp logic, but through the body's response. The places that let you breathe deeper are kept. The places that make you shrink are gently set down, without blame, without judgment. You begin choosing connections with depth, not many, just enough that you don't have to perform being agreeable. Conversations where silence isn't misunderstood. Moments beside someone where you don't need to prove your worth. And there are times when you allow yourself to step back, not out of anger, not out of disappointment, simply because you recognize that a place no longer matches your current rhythm of breath. This stepping back doesn't feel like loss. It feels like respect for yourself, and respect for the other person's journey as well. When Libra stops seeking validation from the outside, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel enough. Not enough because you have everything, but enough because you're no longer missing yourself. From here on, belonging is no longer a question that needs an answer. It's no longer something to achieve. It becomes a lived experience, showing up in very ordinary moments. In a morning when you wake up without heaviness. In a conversation where you don't weigh every word. In an evening when you're alone but don't feel lonely. Libra comes to understand that belonging isn't about staying somewhere for a long time. It's about not abandoning yourself while you're there. And when you carry that feeling into your relationships, everything feels lighter. You no longer cling. You no longer fear being left. You no longer hold on tightly to prove your worth. You stay because you choose to, and you leave when it's necessary. No drama, no long explanations. There may still be moments when you wonder where you stand in someone else's story. But unlike before, that question no longer unsettles you, because you know exactly where you stand in your own. And from there, belonging is no longer something you search for. It becomes a state of presence, a very quiet sense of ease, an experience you carry with you, whether you're with someone or simply by yourself. If there is one thing Libra can carry with them during this season, it isn't a big piece of advice, and it isn't a final answer to every question. It's simply a very small permission, but one that's enough to soften an entire stretch of the road. You don't need to be perfect to deserve to stay. You don't need to always be understanding. You don't need to always show up at the right moment, in the right role, meeting everyone else's expectations. Your worth isn't measured by how well you please everyone, but by how honest you are with yourself. Libra has always lived with a strong sense of balance. You know when to move forward and when to step back. You know how to soften the edges so things feel smoother. But now, you begin to realize something essential. Real balance cannot exist if you're always the one doing the adjusting alone. True balance begins when you are respected, not just loved. When your words carry weight. When your boundaries don't need justification. When your presence is not taken for granted. Connection, in any form, it doesn't need to be proven through constant sacrifice. It's nurtured through safety, through the feeling that you can breathe deeply and still be allowed to stay. Over time, the sense of belonging also becomes clearer, not as a reward, not as a fixed place, but as an inner state. You begin to notice that every time you betray your own feelings just to keep the surface calm, you leave yourself behind a little. And every time you choose honesty, even in silence, you are coming back. Belonging doesn't come from trying to be the most agreeable version of yourself. It comes from not having to hide the parts that are real. You don't need to shrink your sadness to fit the room. You don't need to exaggerate your joy to make others comfortable. When Libra allows themselves to stay with their inner truth, and everything around them begins to change slowly, not everyone stays, not every connection continues, but what remains has a different quality, less noise, but more durability. There may still be moments of doubt, days when you wonder if you're being too strict, if holding boundaries is making you distant. Those questions are human, and you don't need to push them away. Just remember this: every time you choose not to betray yourself, you are setting a new standard for how you are treated, not through demands, but through your clear, steady presence. Let things continue to become clear in their own natural way. Don't rush the answers. Don't try to control the unfolding. There's no need to name the future too quickly. Some things can only be understood when you move slowly enough to feel them, quietly enough to listen, and bravely enough not to turn away from yourself. Libra was not born to live in constant tension. You were born to bring harmony, but not by sacrificing yourself, by showing up fully with your truth. And perhaps the most healing thing in this season isn't finding more answers, but allowing yourself to stay with your real emotions, to stay with your own breath, to stay with the person you are becoming. There's nowhere you need to go, nothing left to prove. Just stay with your truth.